We're going to talk about the stomach now. This is a subject that bothers an awful lot of people in many ways. It's one that really classifies people. They say you're really not up there in business unless you got stomach ulcers. Got stomach ulcers, you should be on the chairman of the board or vice president or something like this. But it isn't that funny. I've had stomach ulcers and bleeding ulcers, and it is a very, very scary and sad condition. But a good, healthy stomach is so important. A lot of our digestion is done in the stomach itself. But we've got to take care of it, and over a period of time eating properly and the right liquids, it can take care of itself. But number one, if we have stomach ulcers, let's go into this subject right at the beginning. A stomach ulcer is through improper food intake or liquid intake, as it is with alcohol and things of this type. So we've got to watch our diet in the first place. But if we have this problem, there are a number of things that we can use. We have, let's go into an herb we use in the garden called okra. Okra is rather a smooth operation. It's a little on the slimy side, but you can doll it up, and it's not too recognizable, but it is a great healer. I have a friend, a naturopathic physician down in New Orleans, that has made up okra tablets and has become quite independent on just selling okra tablets. That's the only ones he ever makes. But there are so many people with ulcers, and they get some help from it. And I guess if you take enough of it, it would have maybe eventually cure the ulcer. But there are still faster ways than that. We've got other things like cabbage juice. Cabbage juice has done miracles with stomach ulcers. We find that people who go on a 3-day cleanse and a mucusless diet get relief quite quickly from this condition. We have also another one which is our top, we feel, and that's cayenne. This sounds so ridiculous. I remember in Vancouver, British Columbia, our lesson that day was cayenne. And I raised my little fat hand. I was in my 30s, and I said, "Why are we studying cayenne? It'll eat the lining out of your stomach." And Dr. Nowell, bless his soul, he said, "Oh? And how did you find that out?" And I said, "Oh, my mother told me." And everybody in the class laughed except Dr. Nowell. And he said, "Well, what was her herbal degree?" Well, I said, I got the picture right then. I said, "Well, I guess she didn't have one." He said, "Could you stay after class?" And I said, "Yes." So I did. And at his expense, in his car with his gas, he drove me around Vancouver, British Columbia, and introduced me to nearly a dozen people whose lives had been saved with cayenne. And there is a great teacher, one who went out of his way and sold me a bill of goods. I mean, I had come back to Salt Lake City knowing that, boy, this was my introduction back to Zion, where I knew everybody would just say, "Hallelujah. We got the right man here," because Brigham Young used to teach about using cayenne. Well, I talked about cayenne, and people just turned their back on me. I estimate that at that time, which was over 30 years ago, I don't think there was a pound of cayenne used in the entire state of Utah for medicinal purposes. It was really something. We were quite concerned in trying to educate people. And through lecturing and teaching, I finally got people wanting cayenne. Then I didn't have any place to buy it. At that time, we didn't have any herb outlets in our health stores, or it was a little rough. Well, I went down to Cook Tea and Coffee. They furnish condiments for the restaurants. And I said, Mr. Cook, could my students and patients buy cayenne from you? Nope. I said, why not? He says, we only sell wholesale. Well, in what condition would it be wholesale? They had to buy at least a pound at a time, and no sensible person ever buy a pound of that stuff. Well, supposing you would buy a pound. Nope. I said, we haven't got any place to buy it, and I'd like them to. Well, if they come in and say they're one of your students, one of your patients, I'll let them buy a pound. But that's the only way they can get it. Several years went by, and I went back into Cook Tea and Coffee. Mr. Cook, who was head and shoulders higher than me and a great big guy, put his arm around me and gave me a squeeze, and he says, gee, I'm glad you came in. I sure like you. And I said, what's all this about? Well, he said, I've been with my accountant this morning, and we just found out that since you came in, over 3 tons of cayenne has been sold to your students and patients. He said, over these years, he said, they're crazy. And he said, but as long as they're crazy, keep them coming in. He says, you can't get me to take it, but there we are. Well, we have had case after case with stomach ulcers where they have been healed very quickly. And this is one of the fastest foods we know of because it will feed the mucous membrane. It puts iron and calcium back into the area. It doesn't soothe and whitewash over like milk does. That's all that does, is just act as Ellsmer's glue does and glue on a little temporary relief. But that's where your case for Ellsmer's glue comes from. With the cayenne, it actually heals. We have interesting cases of people who have ridiculed us, but one man wanted to commit suicide. He was in such pain with his stomach ulcers. Nobody was home, and his wife had cleaned out all the poisons from the drug shelves, the medicine cabinet. He couldn't find anything to kill himself with. Nothing was left in there but a big can of cayenne. And he hated the even thought of cayenne because his wife was kind of herb-minded. Well, he thought, that'll kill me, if anything will. So he said I took a tablespoonful of it and then rushed in and put my head under a pillow. I was all alone. I didn't want the neighbors to hear me in my dying shrieks. I put a pillow over my head and laid there to die. And he said, next thing I knew, my wife shook me in the morning and said, wake up, you got to get to work. It's the first night you ever slept in years, but you slept all night long. And he said, there was no pain down there? Well, he said, I kept using the cayenne, and he says, I'm healed. So we won a man over to our team with getting rid of his stomach ulcers. This is one of the greatest foods for the stomach, the bowels, for the veins and arteries. There is nothing to equal it. In this case, when we have a severe stomach ulcer condition, we don't recommend starting with 1/3 of a teaspoon or 1/4 of a teaspoon and working up. We just say, take that teaspoon and get it down you. And when it's down, you'll find immediate relief, as most people do. So we've got a combination of, for people with weak stomachs and stomach ulcers that are afraid to start with the cayenne, is I take 3 parts of slippery elm, 3 parts of comfrey, that's the leaf or the root, 3 parts of mullein, and 1 part of lobelia. and make this into a tea or make it into capsules and drink it with comfrey tea. If you take 2 or 3 of these capsules and use comfrey tea to wash it down, it makes a double aid. But you'll find over a period of time very thorough and very complete relief. Sometimes we run into troubles with the stomach of having not enough acid or too much acid, hydrochloric acid malfunction, out of balance. So there are ways of doing this. You can go down to the drugstore or the health store, either one, and buy some hydrochloric acid. One supposedly organic and the other is supposedly just straight hydrochloric acid like you use in the chemistry lab, but weakened down. And this will give you more hydrochloric acid. Well, if you, or you can use Tums. Yes, you know, but there are many alkalins and well, this is a market within itself because of the number of people with acid malfunction. But when you do this, you have worked on the effect and haven't gone to the cause. And so by working on the effect, the organ that makes the hydrochloric acid says, well, so you're not satisfied with what I'm doing? Nuts to you. And it just stops. It doesn't work anymore. And now you're in a worse condition. All right, we have a very simple food for that, which is a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar and a tablespoon of honey. Put these in distilled water, stir it up, and it makes a rather pleasant drink. And do this 3 or more times a day. And you will find after a period of time, some people within a week or 2, some people it takes some months, but you'll find that hydrochloric acid starts flowing at the right amount. Not too much, not too little, but just the right amount. And we have gone to the cause of rebuilding the organ that has been starved to death and hasn't worked properly. The honey that we use, it's always best to use honey from your own neighborhood, in your own backyard, under your own fig tree. In other words, in the county or the area close by. The reason for this is a good example. Supposing you got hay fever, we'd say, well, one of the finest things for hay fever is during your 3-day cleanse to take some honeycomb and just chew on honeycomb and use a lot of it over those 3 days. You say, fine, that's a nice sweet way to do it, which it is. But the small print is the honeycomb from your own area. You could use the honeycomb that your good friend just brought you back from Hawaii. That would be delicious. A little orchid in it, you know, and everything. Very fine honey. But you know what's caused the hay fever isn't the pollen from orchids. It's the pollen from your flowers in your own backyard. And that is why we believe in eating our foods proper, the herbs that are called vegetables and fruits, from our own backyard, under our own fig tree. In other words, at our own latitude, longitude, altitude, at our own atmospheric pressure. And we will find that we will have long life. And we will have less hospital and doctor bills. And so it is with the honey. Use the honey from your own area. And the apple cider vinegar, use the best type you can get. Don't get the synthetics. Try to get some from a health store or some that has got a little mother growing in it. And that is good, regardless of what brand it is. The stomach itself, being a digestive organ, is the introduction into getting value out of our food. And in getting the value out of our food, the best thing to do is get the digestive juices working. We have in the mouth the saliva glands. And by mixing saliva with the foods that we eat, the juices that we drink, we now have turned on the digestive juices in the stomach. When we do not have saliva mixed with our foods, they go right on through, and they do not attract the digestive juices for reaction. And that's why we get such a low food value out of what we eat. Let's chew our food thoroughly, get plenty of saliva in it, and then the gastric juices start to flow in the stomach. And when they do that, we've got a good, healthy condition. The gastric juices converts the food so it can be assimilated and not just accepted. And here is working on the cause again, not on the effect. The effect is just to eat food. And if we gulp it down, inhale it in other words, it goes right on through and does not get digested. But if we get the saliva and the digestive juices working on it, then we get better assimilation and less accepted material that will cause us problems. Let's go now into bleeding from the bowels. This bleeding from the bowels or from the stomach can be very frightening. This can be stopped oftentimes with cayenne, and by continual use of cayenne can overcome this. But then we have times when we don't get this result as fast as we should. It's once in a while a person lets down. But we do have a very fine formula for this healing of the bowels when they're bleeding. And this is using mullein, the same one that we talked about for the glandular system. Now we're using it for bleeding in the bowel area. But it must be mixed with milk. This is something that shocks people because we're supposedly weaned and we don't use milk anymore because the only animals on the face of the earth that'll go back to milk after being weaned are a few humans. And so this is rather a shock for me to even say milk, but there is a purpose for it. The mullein itself is the healer, but the mullein will not adhere to the bleeding area, though it vibrates right to that area. It washes off quickly, and it needs to be adhered, glued on. The milk that we mix the mullein with is the same thing that we get glue out of. I got an education in my teenage years of being a cabinet maker, and I worked under an old artisan, and he always would tell me the best glue makes the best furniture, and the best glue comes from cow's milk. All right, we've got the key, because the cow has over 20 times more casein in the milk than the human body can assimilate. So the balance of it is left to be accepted in the form of Elmer's glue. That's what it actually is. It's just glue. So it takes the mullein and pastes it onto the side of the wall and keeps it there a little bit longer. We take an ounce of the mullein herb and simmer it for 5 minutes, very slow simmer, in a pint of whole milk. Now it's best the raw milk, but if you can't, get the pasteurized. And strain it, and immediately after a bowel movement, have the individual drink the full pint, and after each bowel movement, have a pint. The bowel movements at first will come quite frequently because as the blood runs down in there, it causes pressure, and it feels like they need a BM. We have had cases that have been taken out of the hospital after weeks, not being able to get in to cauterize and being too weak to operate on, and in one case too heavy a weight for operation. They'd been in the hospital taking infusions for weeks. Were taken home, and in one case, early in the morning, we gave them the formulas, and by night, the bleeding had stopped. It works this fast. There is nothing can frighten a person much more than seeing blood in a stool. It is really something that panics. And if it's really dark blood, then it's from up in the stomach area, and that means stomach ulcer. So we have to watch that. We have in the stomach an organ that is very, very delicate. And if we eat the wrong kind of food, we can eat the lining out. And so I can give you one type of food that will never interfere with the stomach lining, the mucusless diet. Had to get a key in there, a plug once in a while. That is the one that'll do the job. We've now also coming back to the bleeding from the bowels. Oak bark, bayberry bark, both of them are astringents. And to drink the tea, or to take an enema with the concentrated tea. In other words, simmer the tea down to half or 1/4 its original amount and then insert it into the rectum. And this has saved a lot of lives. It's really very potent. Even if it isn't too severe a condition, red raspberry leaf tea will help. Taking cayenne along with it. This program of getting the stomach into good condition is important in this reason. We find that the more food that we eat, the more we have to store up for disastrous times. And I am not trying to scare anybody. I'm just trying to frighten you. But it is the truth. We are in a 7-year drought, and it's progressing along, even with all the snow we've had. A good hot wind can remove that moisture so fast that things can bleach out even this year. We are in the same repeating drought that Joseph had back in Egypt, a 7-year drought. If you would like to go into the scriptures, it gives a history that's almost like it was written for today when it tells about Joseph in Israel, the 47th section, or 47th chapter of Genesis, starting with your 12th verse. It tells how that the grain was all gone, and so they came in because they had no more money, and they had to turn over their cattle, they had to turn over their lands, and finally to keep from starving. We're coming so close to this. Take it for granted now that we have been just eating like everybody else eats, inhaling our foods, gulping it down, grabbing a snack here and a snack there, some Twinkies from this store and some, you know what I mean. So we're getting very poor assimilation. Lots of acceptance, but poor assimilation. And the assimilation is 8%. Now we clean out the bowels. We get the stomach working properly. We get the bloodstream flowing well. And you know what? We will eat about 1/3 or 1/4 of what we ate originally without that continual craving, that hunger that's with us all the time. And because we're not craving all the time, we don't eat as much. But we're getting better assimilation. So we're getting 40 to 45% assimilation instead of 8%, and eating only 1/3. So we've got now a program wherein what instead of being stored up for 2 years for one person would practically feed a small family by distributing it. And of course, going on your 7th day fast with just distilled water, and that gives you enough that you can invite the neighbors in for dinner and be really sociable about the whole thing. This is more critical than we want to stress, because those people who are healthy are going to go through the bad conditions that are coming up, and this is one way to do it. We've got another subject we want to go into, and that subject is the heart. And the heart happens to be a very important organ. Very important. When it stops, we stop. And there is no need for it stopping, as it does with so many people. Between now and this time tomorrow, 24 hours from now, there will be over 50,000 people fall over with heart attacks. 50,000 people. They won't all die. But before the year's out, there will be 3 million people die of heart attacks. It is getting one of our top killers. One reason is because we have starved that heart. Number 2, we are living in a day of fear, and fear causes heart attacks. Not just because it's getting close to tax time, but you know what I mean. It's just a fearful thing, because unless you know the way around, you fear that you're going to be with the people that aren't going to make the grade. And if we make the grade for the next 20-odd years, we might slip into the millennium and get 1,000 years of peace. 1,000 years. A week right now would be nice, huh? But 1,000 years of peace. And that heart can last 1,000 years without any trouble. That heart, from the time of Adam down to Noah, lasted 900, 960, 980. It was never allowed to go the full 1,000 years, but it came right close to that 1,000-year time. Man, from the time of Adam down to Noah, was a vegetarian. And if you don't believe in the scriptures, go to Josephus. He was a hard-headed historian, and he'll tell you the same thing. There's no history of meat eating. But the people lived a long time. And when they lived a long time, they lived with happiness. But at the time of Noah, he was told that there was going to be a flood. And he was told to put 2 of the unclean and 7 of the clean animals on. When the ark landed on Mount Ararat, it landed in a sterile area because the salt water had killed all vegetation. And they had to turn to eating meat. They liked it. And in 3 generations, just 3 generations, they dropped from nearly 1,000 years down to 120 years. In 3 generations. Where does that fit in with us? During that 1,000 years of peace, the conditions are that the lamb will lie down with the lion, the bear with the ox, the child will play at the cockatrice's den, a poisonous insect will never be injured, and there will be no harm or hurt in all my kingdom, says the Lord. So if we aren't vegetarians, the only way we're going to get a piece of meat is to take a quick bite as the animal comes by. It'll be a little rare. Might get a few hair in your teeth, but I can't see any other way around because you can't kill them. Well, putting all joking to one side, we can never go into the millennium as meat eaters. It's impossible. The 49th section of our own Doctrine and Covenants in the church I belong to says, the man who says you must abstain from meat is not of God. And this is true because it's backing up our 89th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, wherein it says, and during times of cold, winter, or famine, we are to eat meat. All right, we take lower life to sustain upper life. And so when you take and put your arm to the square and say, I will never touch meat, you are going against the Word of God when he says it is to be used during times of emergency. But we will have plenty of fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, and seeds if we work it right. We just won't have to have a famine. Let's talk about this heart. We've starved it. We have given it the rottenest, poorest, most horrible foodstuffs, and it's just limping along with most people right now, just barely getting by. And it stops once in a while, and someone rushes over and puts a nitroglycerin capsule under the tongue. And that nitroglycerin tablet, it's a whip. It whips up the heart, and the heart starts beating right fast again. And gathers together some calcium and other foods and keeps limping along, and maybe we survive. That is what it's doing. It's whipping it. You know, you can whip a horse, and that horse, you keep it going for a while, but all of a sudden, it's going to lay over and die because you forgot to feed it. The same thing with the heart. All right, we've been called on many heart cases, on house calls, where the people have passed out, they're lying there. We have never lost a case in 35 years. And why? Because we prop them up after we bring them to, and we put down them a cup of cayenne tea. A teaspoon of cayenne and a cup of hot water. And I use the hot water to expand the cell pore areas so that the cayenne will go in fast. Goes directly to the heart, and then while they shake their head and they're sitting up and they say, let's go to a dance or something. Yes, we've had them actually say, oh, I feel like I want to do something now. My heart's okay. What have we done? Instead of working on the effect, using a whip to stir it up and whip it, we have gone to the cause and fed that heart. And cayenne goes directly to the heart area. And there is your key, a perfect food. And it goes in and it feeds the heart. And if you'll keep that cayenne going in, that heart can be rebuilt. But it's got to be done faithfully. Not religiously, but faithfully. Faithfully is using it as many times as you should a day, 6 days a week in and week out, go on and on and on. That's doing it faithfully. Religiously is Christmas and Easter. We have other ways of feeding that heart, and some of the other ways are extremely important. The mucusless diet. I'm getting that key in as often as I can, because your whole grains are loaded with the very vitamins and minerals that are needed for a good, strong heart. But if we can't depend on the food on the table alone to do the job, and we need something a little extra, the hawthorn berry is your next. The hawthorn berry, according to Potter's Topical Cyclopedia, which is the old English herbal herbalist Bible, it says the hawthorn berry has one specific. It is a cardiac food. And this is what it really is. It's one of the richest foods for the heart that we have. It can be taken in the form of a tea, or you can make it into capsules, tablets with hawthorn berry and maybe some cayenne with it. There's different combinations. But your hawthorn berry will rebuild a heart. It doesn't matter what type of a heart malfunction. That's another wonderful thing about our type of program. You know, there are several hundred different types of heart diseases. If I went in and started through one after another to find out which disease they had, to find out what to give them for it, they'd die before I could get down to number 6. So what do? We go to the cause and feed it right now. So with the hawthorn berry, I'm going to give you a formula for hawthorn berry syrup now. And this formula is one that has saved many people by getting their hearts whole once more. This hawthorn berry syrup, I'll give it to you as quickly as I can, is made up by taking your hawthorn berries. If they're fresh, a pan full of them, just about 2 inches from the top. If they are dried berries, then you would rehabilitate them with distilled water. And when they are back up to regular full size again, have it so that it's still 2 inches from the top. Cover with distilled water so that the water is 1 inch above the berries. Put it on to simmer at under 130, just a low simmer, for 15 or 20 minutes. And as it simmers, stir it so that it won't stick. Then set it to one side and let it steep for 15 or 20 minutes. Strain it. The water that you strain off of it, the liquid you strain off, put into a clean container, a pan, and set to one side. Now you mash the berries with a potato masher or some type of an instrument, and cover these with distilled water again. The reason I use distilled water, we get 30% more efficiency in any teas or any herbal aids that we use with distilled water. We cover it to at least 1 inch above the mashed berries, and this time we'll have to do more stirring, and we simmer it for 20 minutes again and steep it for 20 minutes after it has finished simmering. We strain it, strain all the liquids off, press it out, and this liquid that we take off the second time, we add to the liquid from the first time and stir it up. We put it into the clean pan and put it on the stove and simmer it slowly. Do not let it boil under any condition. A slow simmer with the lid off, and it takes long times. You've got to be patient with this. And if you don't have the time for patience, put it into a double boiler and do it this way. But let it come down to 1/4 its original amount. In other words, before you put the liquids in the pan, if you've got a gallon of the liquid, take and put a quart mark on the bottom of the pan up to 1 quart, and then just keep simmering. But you'll have to stir this very regularly because it must not stick on the bottom. And it has some solids in now that would stick quite easily. And you stir it until you've got it down to 1/4 the original amount. This makes what we call a 7-power concentrate. And this is a little on the heavy side now, a little thicker. We take it off the stove and we add to this 1/4 of the finished amount. For instance, we've come from a gallon, use this just as round figures, down to a quart. So now we'd use 1/4 of the quart with grape brandy. That would be an 8-ounce. That would be a pint, pardon me. We're down to a quart. 8 ounces was correct in the first place. 8 ounces. And also add 1/4 of vegetable glycerin, which would be 8 ounces of vegetable glycerin. Now, this vegetable glycerin has the same USP as your animal glycerin or your petroleum glycerin, which we don't advise at all. And stir this up thoroughly. Bottle it in dark acetane bottles and cork it tightly. Turn the bottle upside down in paraffin wax and wax the lid on. And we have now got our heart tonic all put up for future use. The dosage, 1/2 teaspoon, 1/2 teaspoon, 3 times a day. This is the adult dose. In fact, this is the only good tasting herbal combination we've got. And it'll taste so good people want to gulp it down. Well, after you've stirred this for 12, 14 hours, you will hit anybody over the head that wants to take more than 1/2 teaspoon at a time, because it's hard to make, but it works. We had a case during one of our lecture series years ago when we used to read eyes. This woman had leakage of the heart and had a cardiac dropsy. Her ankles were swollen and had been for 14 years. For 4 years, they had never seen her ankles. This was it in 4 years' time, because the ankle bone had always puffy. And we had her take the hawthorn berry syrup, which was 1/2 teaspoon 3 times a day. This was on a Tuesday, and Thursday night at the lecture, the lady's son said, "Would you mind if my mother came up front?" And she came up front, and he said, "I want you all to look at her ankle." And she put her foot up on a chair, and he says, "It's the first time I've seen her ankle bones in 4 years." And that was in 3 days of using this. Now, it doesn't work with everybody that fast, but it does the job. And over a period of time, my own dad-in-law had leakage of the heart from the time he was born. They carried him around on a pillow as a baby. He was so delicate. And he could never pass any type of a test for a job test at all. Anytime he'd have to take a physical, they would turn him down because of leakage of the heart. He started taking this when he was 62, and when he was 65, he took a physical with a clean bill of health. And the doctor said, "You'll never die of a heart attack." He said, "You got a healthy heart." And he lived until he was 81 and didn't die of a heart attack. Folks, that heart is an extremely important area. We have got, this can be used as a tea. It can be used in many ways. This is good for the veins, good for the arteries again, and helps rebuild them because it's high in calcium. We also have another herbal tea that is good for the heart, which is sassafras. And sassafras tea is excellent. Now, don't worry about the saffron, because we don't isolate it. We give it in its wholesome state. And the other parts of the herb takes care of the little part that could be damaging if it were isolated. So this is the key, and that's why in the scriptures it says all herbs in their wholesome state. But we still don't recommend using sassafras tea too long at a time, anytime over 6 weeks, and it thins the bloodstream down sometimes a little too much. So we'll have to kind of watch that. But it is very good for cutting the cholesterol out and keeping the bloodstream good and clean. We have, with the heart, other things that are supposedly very good, which would be your vitamin E, wheat germ oil. This is good in emergency, and to use it, we've seen remarkable results with wheat germ oil. But we do say, if you will start eating the grains in their wholesome state, you won't have to use just the oil alone, because you'll get all the value you need from the whole grains. That is wheat, buckwheat, rye, barley, millet. Any of these are excellent and very high in all of your vitamin B's and your minerals. Have you any questions now you'd like to ask?
When we were talking about the stomach ulcers, and you gave us a formula, or did you give us a formula in addition? Oh yes, the slippery elm, this other formula. Would, if you wanted to really work on the ulcers, would it be a good idea to take the cayenne in addition to this? I mean, you could.
Oh, that cayenne is a blessing in any condition. Whatever it is, it'll speed it up, because that is the stimulant. That doesn't mean it's an alcohol or any of that type, because an alcohol is a depressant, but a stimulating herb is one that stimulates the cells and the tissues and gives them more life and vitality.
I have another question, Dr. Christopher. We were talking about bleeding from the stomach and the bowels. How would you use the mullein and milk for stomach or hemorrhoids, bleeding ulcers? How often and...
Well, with the stomach, it's a little different than the bowel itself, because it takes longer for it to get contact through the small intestines and everything else. So in this case, you would have to use a pint of this, but use it in cup forms. Use a cup every half hour. The problem is, after you've used it this way, you would have to eventually clean out all of that that accepted but not assimilated merchandise called glue. So it's better really to go the other way if you can, with the herbs and the cayenne.
Dr. Christopher, a question has been handed to me that I'm relaying to you. This is on the bleeding. In case the bleeding has been stopped, let's say of the lower bowel or anywhere in the intestinal tract, is there any way to ensure that the bleeding will not reoccur?
Yes, the best thing to do, number one, when the bleeding stops, as an example, we say continue on with every bowel movement for the next day or two, using this after each bowel movement. And then at least for 3 days, have it 3 times a day. But in the meantime, we're changing this diet. And there is the key. Get them back living like a human should live.
The barberry formula that you gave us for jaundice or hepatitis, I didn't get the tea, 1/2 a cup every how often?
Oh, during a siege, when we're having it
Yes.
every half hour or every hour, it's if it gets a little too nauseating, you'll have to stretch it out. There are no two patients alike. We can't stamp them all with the U.S. stamp. I mean, we can't. We've got to be careful, because some people have a high nervous temperament and other people don't. You know, this whole thing we're talking about, the veins and the arteries and what to do when we have phlebitis, what to do when we have varicosity. Well, one of the worst cases of varicose veins is hemorrhoids and piles. This is what it really is. Because in the lower part of the bowel, we have an accumulation of old fecal matter that has been there for a long period of time. And this fecal matter has in it a lot of sugars and starches. The human body wants to get rid of it, and so it'll try and get all the liquids from the body it can to try and flush it out. But there isn't enough liquid because the average individual doesn't drink enough. What liquids get down there will absorb anything that's soluble, and the most soluble thing you've got is the sugars. And so it takes it on over to the veins, and that weakens the veins. And those veins get weaker and weaker in that bowel area until they start to swell up. And when we find that we're so constipated and we're trying to strain to get a BM, right, they break. And then we have bleeding ulcers. This condition here can be aided. Of course, we go to the basic cause, you understand, diet and right on through. But we make an oak bark suppository by mixing oak bark and vegetable glycerin. Or if you don't have vegetable glycerin, you can use Vaseline, petrolatum, or you can use olive oil and make it into a paste and make it in the shape of a suppository. Put it into the refrigerator so that it'll solidify and get hard. Now, before you insert that, put up a peeled button of garlic into the rectum as far as you can. Now, this will clean up any infection, and the sulfur in the garlic starts doing a healing process. And in addition now, just before retiring at night is when we put the garlic up there, we insert the oak bark suppository and put it up as far as we can and leave it there. It and the garlic will come out with the first bowel movement in the morning. But during the night, the astringency will start feeding this particular weak area. And the calcium that's in the oak bark or the bayberry bark, if you can't get the oak, you can use bayberry, B-A-Y-B-E-R-R-Y. Don't get barberry or bearberry. Get bayberry. But the oak bark is so heavy in calcium that it starts to rebuild those veins and starts giving them aid. Now, if we also take the cayenne and work up to a teaspoon 3 times a day and do some jogging, you will find remarkable results. We have seen cases of our patients with hemorrhoids that have had to be held up with a harness because they would hang down between their legs 5-6 inches. And they would have to be pushed back up in and then a harness put on to hold them in. We have seen them in a matter of 6 weeks to 3 months come back up into place again and stay in place by following the program.